Hi, and welcome to the Citizens Climate Engagement Network event live from the SDG Media Zone in the Green Zone at COP22. My name is Joe Robertson. I'm the Global Strategy Director for Citizens Climate Lobby. And I'm just going to say a few words and then let the rest of the panel say a few words about themselves, and then we'll get started. What we do in Citizens Climate Lobby is we work with citizen volunteers to help them develop the expertise, the organizational capacity, their ability to network and connect to resources so that they can become skilled policy advisors for their own lawmakers. We're working on 6 continents, and actually one of our regional coordinators is now in Antarctica, so that makes 7 continents. The goal here for us is to try to make sure that the decisions that are being made at the global level and in national planning processes are informed by citizens, by people who are living and breathing the results of what's being decided. So we'll talk a little bit about that later on, and I'll just pass the microphone to Dana to give you her introduction.
Hello, my name is Dana Patterson, and I have been with Citizens Climate Lobby since 2010. I'm also a master's student at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, studying climate change and science communication and strategies around narrative building. And I am really excited to be on this panel to talk about how we can engage people and how we can activate and build networks for change post-COP22.
My name is Naomi Lipke, and I've been a member of Citizens Climate Lobby since 2011. I did a master's degree in Stockholm on participatory design and participatory governance, and now I'm leading a project related to that I'll be telling you about shortly.
And my name is Laughlin Artz, and I have been affiliated with Citizens Climate Lobby now for about 3 years, mainly in partnership with Joe, who was instrumental in bringing about what's now a project we have called 2020 or Bust, which right in line with Citizens Climate Lobby and the Citizens Climate Engagement Network really is out to empower the individual to bridge the gap between what we need to have happen to end the climate crisis and where the Paris Agreement currently takes us.
Thank you, everybody. So I'd just like to take a minute to say that today in Morocco is Independence Day. And I think it's been well timed that it's Independence Day on the last day of the COP22. The reason I think it's well timed is that we're not going to really have a future where independence is a norm in the human space if we don't solve the climate crisis. So one way to look at what's happening at the COP22 and in the whole COP process is that this is a global design studio. It's a global congress that happens every year where the world comes together to figure out how we design a future economy, a future political infrastructure of the world that allows for people to live with freedom and dignity in their local communities, pursuing their talents and their ambitions to the best of their abilities. So I think that's been fundamentally misunderstood by a lot of people who aren't part of the negotiating process or aren't part of the expert bodies that inform the negotiating process. And so that's where we come to this discussion of citizen participation. Our thinking about the nationally determined contributions to the implementation of the Paris Agreement, the global climate solution, is that they are, like the Sustainable Development Goals, a map of human need and capability. They show us what we're trying to accomplish, they show us where our deficits are, and they help us to essentially, across the world, collaborate to better understand what we need to do to get to the kind of world we want to live in. Since we're here in the SDG Media Zone, I want to say something about the World We Want platform. Some of the partners that are here today hosting us also work with the World We Want, the My World Survey, the UN Millennium Campaign. And the My World Survey was essentially put into the field across the world in 175 countries, I believe, to hear from people what they wanted the next 15 years of global development to be about. And what was found when 8 million plus people responded, 80% of those responses offline, not digital, but on paper, some of them taken as dictation from people who needed translation, was that when you ask millions of people what they want their governments to do, they give much more ambitious answers than people in the political realm assume they would. And that's how we ended up with 17 sustainable development goals, not just one that focuses on sustainability. So in reality, that's what we're here to talk about today, how people can actually play a role in making sure we meet those high ambitions. Just a quick footnote before I pass the microphone. The Citizens Climate Engagement Network is a global engagement strategy designed to expand the civic space and give people everywhere the ability to convene local meetings that will filter ideas up into the global process. There's a coalition of support behind this process where each of us, individuals and organizations, some inside the UN system, some non-governmental organizations, are committing to make sure those ideas do flow into the global discussion. So I'd just like to maybe start a bit of a conversation here based on different perspectives, how we can actually make that kind of thing into a reality. And maybe we go first to Dana to hear about, you know, the kind of narrative that's beginning to be built as people's voices are becoming more useful to the global process.
Thanks, Joe. So one of the most important things to recognize when you're trying to build these narratives is that many people have different values, and a lot of times those values overlap. So the first step is to, when you're working with someone, whether it be someone who has the same beliefs as you or someone who's completely in opposition to what you're doing, is to really get down to the core value. What motivates them, what drives their organization. Personal values and organizational values may be different, and so trying to recognize, identify, and then use those values to drive your narratives to what you're trying to say. So the work that I do at Yale with Professor Paul Lussier is we're using humanistic communications to build these narratives, and that's very important because people can then begin to connect with what you're saying. If you automatically go in with a scientific narrative, many people around the world are not going to understand that or are going to immediately turn off because it's not something that sounds really interesting. And so if you can find what those people are interested in, whether it be through their religion, through business, through food, through whatever cultural values it may be, you can really begin to understand and drive those conversations to be more productive and more interesting. And those build these foundational relationships with anyone across the aisle or in your same community so that you can begin to do the real work together. And it's really important to note that, because if you're trying to have everyone at the table, everyone is being affected by climate change, everyone should be at the table, you really can't automatically turn off the companies that, the oil companies, the natural gas companies, the coal companies. You can't exclude them from the conversation. They need to be part of that in order for them to listen to what needs to happen. So that's what I'd like to add to the conversation. It's always remember, think back to the values of these folks, what's driving them and why. Because if you don't think about that, then the conversations aren't really going to be had, and you'll be having two different conversations.
Thank you, Dana. You just reminded me of an idea that I think is always worth repeating. The climate scientist Katharine Hayhoe, who is also an evangelical Christian, has spent a lot of time trying to figure out how you relate the complexities of climate science to people who don't think about science to guide their moral perspective. And she says basically you have to start from the understanding. It's not a wish or an idea. It's an understanding that most people already live 99% of the values they need to fight climate change. They just haven't had the connection become apparent for them. And so part of the conversation at that table needs to be making sure the table is open to everyone's values, right? So if we're doing that, I think the question then becomes, what are people contributing if they're sharing their values, if they're building a narrative that's inclusive in this way? Are we just adding a lot of cooks to the kitchen, or are we doing something that makes the design process smarter? Naomi, could you tell us a little bit about that?
I think that once you've brought people to the table and they're listening to you, that doesn't mean that they'll still agree on exactly what needs to be done. So a design process can help take different perspectives about what needs to be achieved and how that should be achieved, and try to bring them together in a way that works together. Sometimes in the past when we've designed projects, we've designed them from the perspective that we already know what the conditions are and who's going to be affected. And I think something that's changed in the last 10 years is that we've learned to take more perspectives into account, more different kinds of issues into account. When you get into the urban space, you have water, you have transportation, you have people that are all trying to do something together. And to bring all those issues and problems and people together to the same place, you need a project management framework that can combine those different problems into one design. And so having an iterative conception of how a project is designed and joining together, get other different perspectives can help with that.
And just to clarify, sometimes we hear words like iterative process in the climate negotiations. You mean if there's something set in motion, there is a framework, there is a design with certain parameters, we can upgrade it from time to time in an iterative way,
right.
New iterations of the design.
Right. So you can see how if you're doing a water management project, instead of designing a project and then saying, we're done, you can say, well, actually this didn't work as well as we thought it was going to work. Why is that? How can we find out how to improve it and then change that project slightly or significantly to make it better?
Yeah, I jotted something down as you were talking about the reasons for participatory design, which something that struck me was that non-participatory design, which has been the norm, I think, throughout human history, actually makes a lot of inconvenient assumptions that undermine potentially the efficiency or the relevance of a given urban design project. Is that right?
Yes, I would agree that, confusingly, I think that sometimes projects are designed from a perspective that's way above the issue. And so participatory design emphasizes getting down to a personal level and asking people what's actually occurring on the ground, and then using that to build up a project.
Would it be, in your opinion, would it be flippant to say that essentially urban planners, for instance, have a choice to make between taking feedback from the people who live with the results of their choices and their design processes, or not doing that and somehow assuming that useful information is not needed?
I think that's the way it's been done in the past.
Yeah.
I do think that it's more complex and maybe a little bit more difficult to combine a lot of perspectives, but I think it's more efficient in the long run.
Okay. Well, it's really great to hear not only the perspective, but from experience doing that kind of work. I think that we can say that in this global design process that we're here to witness and to participate in, making sure that those moment-to-moment insights of lived experience are part of the future we design is going to be really important for whether we succeed or not. People having some ownership of the process. Laughlin, you're working on that very thing. I heard someone the other day say, some things just aren't done because they're basically impossible, and you've decided that that's the thing you're going to focus on, right? Yes. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so it's so cool. I mean, everything is just so right in line with everything everybody's saying. What we wanted to bring to the table is, people say, there's a saying, and that information is power. We don't find that to be the case. Certainly there's enough documentaries out there about typhoons and floods and glaciers and polar bears, and people watch it, and fundamentally I think they're just left upset. So you just kind of don't watch it after a while. And we kind of have the perspective that it's not just the information, and that's critical, but what really gives people power is the opportunity. So people just don't see, well, what can I do to actually make a difference? And so they're kind of left in this trance of best efforts and hope, and I'll recycle, and maybe that'll do something, and I'll vote for this person, and that certainly will do something. But so what we wanted to do is bring in the end game of actually ending the crisis, so that the ordinary people anywhere, anyone, whether they're a scientist, not a scientist, most people aren't politicians, most people aren't billionaires or movie stars, so what are we going to do? And so we really came up with this game of what it actually looks like. What's the end zone of ending the crisis? Just like soccer, if you don't know where the goal line is, you can't play the game. And then bring it back and actually measure it out. And we've worked out the formula that if 500 million people actually get involved doing very simple carbon reduction activities, by 2020 we can reduce annual emissions by 8 gigatons, which will in effect get us on track to ending the crisis and bridge the gap between direct action and all the amazing work that the UN and everyone else is doing in the business sector and all of that. So we really wanted to bring the power to end the crisis, bring it back to the individual so that they can know that the action that they're taking today is fundamentally and actionably and practically contributing to the end game of the end of the crisis.
It's brilliant. And so do you want to just say the name of what you're working on?
Yeah, it's
and
called
how people can
2020
find
or
it?
Bust. And the bust part fundamentally is we want to bust up the mythology that people live in, which is this is a problem that somebody else is going to solve, or that we've got time for, or that it isn't that bad. And what we have, the practical part, is that we now have an app that we've just released here called 2020 or Bust. So you can download it from Google or Apple, and you actually get to swipe. I'm going to get into the game of ending the crisis. These are the actions I'm going to take, and then we'll give you a budget that we aggregate over the 4 years until 2020, aggregate it globally so that the whole planet's in on the game of getting on track to ending the crisis by 2020.
Beautiful. It strikes me that part of what you're doing to mobilize people is giving them something affirmational that they can do. So it's not just, everyone else is an innovator and I have to limit my consumption.
Right. That's
it's
right.
actually, I'm an innovator because I'm doing things I didn't think about before and I know how they connect to the rest of the world.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And that kind of knowledge is empowering. Because
and we want to make it sexy too. Like you said, these science things are like boring as heck. No problem. I'm not a scientist though. I never made it through biology. But so we got superheroes and zombies and amazing stuff. We got to get everybody in on this.
When you think about the way the world works, that sounds kind of familiar.
Exactly.
So I'd just like to build on that for a second and say that, part of what this whole global design process is about is figuring out how we mobilize change. So set the right course in terms of the negotiating process. Set the right goals in terms of what kind of scientific information we need. Set the right targets in terms of global emissions reductions and clean development. And then we're also talking about how do we design our cities and our living spaces? How do we contribute to the global effort, not just to the global conversation. And I think it's important that in different ways we're all saying what I think a lot of people here in the green zone are saying, which is it's not enough to give people information or to let them know things. It's very important that they be able to take a step that changes the reality. Dana, I just wanted to ask you, this idea that people's values can drive their message, but also the messaging of others, and that we communicate by involving other people in our communications. How do you see that connecting to things like, participatory design and playing a role in global emissions reductions? How does that go from being messaging to being, lived experience and action in the world?
So I think the first thing is that there's a difference between marketing and framing and narrative building. And what we're trying to say is that values-based, science-congruent narratives are different than framing or messaging. It's building it from the start. It's including everyone at the table from the beginning so that you can start to actually build these relationships. And then once you have these narratives and relationships, then you start to build out your network of people, and you then activate your network, right? And so just making sure that's a key part of this. I think in terms of the world of communications, that communicators are no longer just telling what's happening anymore and telling the messenger, but they're actually the ones who are now connecting people together. And so they have, I think the communications role has a new the communications field has a new role to play in this game, in that they can be these network connectors and they can be these narrative builders. And so it's really important to include communication professionals in this game. And so, and everyone else as well. Business leaders, architects, scientists, economists, and making sure that their expertise is part of this, and that it's not just the environmental community that's telling everyone what has to happen and what needs to be done, but it's actually the economists that are coming out and saying, this is really important, and I am an expert in this field, let's talk. Let's talk to the farmers, let's talk to the people that they never would have connected with. And that's the network building part of it. And I just wanted to speak for a second to what you said before, is building these communities that we want to live in. And this, Joe, I think this speaks to the concept of industrial ecology and industrial symbiosis, in that in an industrial symbiosis community, what that looks like is that means that the industries may have wastes that are put into another industry as a raw material, and that the communities within those areas that the industries are operating also have green space, and the public has an idea of what's going on, and the concept of transparency is very clear here. Everyone is a part of the community, whether that be the industrial leaders, whether it be the business folks, whether it be just the average person that lives within this community. Everyone's part of it, and everyone knows how it's working, and it's sustainable, and it makes sense for everyone. And so I think that we should be having these visions of what we want these communities to look like. Because if we don't have a vision, then how can we ever create what we want? And so it's important to say, okay, well, maybe right now it doesn't seem feasible, but let's do what's impossible, just like Laughlin did. And have that dream and have that vision. And then once we have that vision, we can start to build the narratives and networks to get to that place.
That's really great to hear that the thinking isn't just about saying things, it's about communicating in ways that connect people for action. It strikes me that, in some of the negotiations, you have these facilitated meetings, and they're presided over by co-facilitators who represent different constituencies and make sure there's a diplomatic leadership role there. But in some ways, we're suggesting, I think, somewhat brazenly, but it's also, I think, a natural requirement of this process that everybody everywhere can be a co-facilitator in this global convening. That we're designing a future that's going to be better, cleaner, smarter, healthier, that's going to be sustainable, where people will have access to sustainable prosperity. And one of the subjects that's constantly moving through this space here in Marrakech in the global negotiations is intergenerational equity, climate justice. And I think a message that I know I would like to bring out of Marrakech is that nobody has the right to deny anyone else access to that better future. So while there are people in the world who think it would be easier or cheaper or more profitable to just keep doing things the old-fashioned way, our societies have organized themselves so that we don't collapse, into overwhelming drought and chaos. And that's what we're trying to do here. So I think, I would say, for me, that's the closing message from Marrakech, is no one has the right to deny anyone else access to that better future. That's what we're doing here, and I think we have actually moved from the Paris framework into an action and implementation framework. Could maybe each of you, starting with Laughlin, just say one last thing about what you think is the takeaway from Marrakech and what you're looking forward to?
Well, for me, I think the takeaway, having been in Paris and now here, is that you can just feel that whole propensity for action, that people are in action. People talk, America just had this election, and there was kind of this concern about, the president-elect and what it was going to do, and it was just unmistakable, like person by person, this train is out of the station, it cannot be stopped, we are on a future track of a future sustainability, and we are at work. So I think the thing I'm taking away is that this is now a time. The negotiations are complete. The agreement has been, sealed, and now it's time to get to work, and people are in action. So that's very, very exciting.
Yeah, the events that we've been going to this week have been very focused on finance. I went to a meeting of the finance ministers here in Marrakech, and it's the first time that the finance ministers have come to a COP. So just that is really exciting and a step towards combining urban planning with finance and agriculture and getting a more interdisciplinary interdisciplinary project of joining together different forces to come together to solve climate change. Yeah.
So my takeaway from Paris now to Marrakech is that there is so much work that's happening, and being here at COP in Marrakech, it's obvious that there's a lot more work being done outside of the closed negotiation halls. Is that the real work is being done, it's in action, it's happening all throughout the green zone, all throughout all of the folks that are here, the connections that are being made, the networks that are being built, the conversations that are being had, that this is where the real work occurs. And I think I'm really excited to see all this momentum keep going after COP22, and all of these narratives that we're talking about, let's use them, let's talk to our friends, let's talk to our family, let's talk to business leaders, let's talk to everyone in the conversation, tell them what we've learned, what we've experienced, what we're doing, and run for local office, do all the things that you can to make sure that everyone knows that things are in motion, things are happening, and this is the way the future is going to be, a sustainable future.
Thank you, Dana. I just want to invite Samuel to come and tell us a few words of his own about why youth leadership is so important.
Thank you, Rob. I believe that it's really important for youth to be engaged in climate change, the fight against climate change. The main reason is the fact that when you look, for example, at my continent in Africa, we have more than 50% of the population being youth. And it means that when we are actually going to think about how to keep this development actually sustainable, then we can't really deal without the youth. Because if we only deal with the leaders, then it means when they're out, then there will be nobody to really take on. And I'm really happy about the intensity we've had all this while. We've been here, and then we had lots of school children coming in, singing. They're all learning about how to preserve the environment and how to really make the environment wonderful. And to me, in my opinion, that's what I think is really needed. When you have children already starting from the educational level, thinking about how to preserve the environment, then we know that between now and 20 years, between now and 50 years, we would be making gradual progress, and we would have to keep our continent, and not only our continent, the world, well over, as good as it's supposed to be. Because according to meteorologists, more than 80% of natural disasters can be attributed to climate change recently. So I believe we really need the youth, and I'm really happy about what is going on here in Marrakech. Thank you.
So I just want to close by saying a few thank yous. I want to thank the Public Foundation and the UN Foundation and Earth to Marrakech for hosting this SDG Media Zone. I think it's important that we talk about how we're going to get these things right. And I'd also like to say thank you to the 50,000 citizen volunteers of Citizens Climate Lobby, 250 of whom went to Washington, D.C. this week to make sure that their lawmakers know what we're talking about here, that this is irreversible, that this is the way we get to a better future. And there is no other way to do it except to get everybody involved and get it right. Thank you.